University Sapienza of Rome, and I'm today here with my colleague and friend Uwe Sunde.
Exactly. Hello. Also from my side, I'm Uwe Sunde. I'm professor of economics at LMU Munich, and we're happy to present some of our work today that fits into our work theme of the recipe program that I believe most of you or all of you are aware of and know. So we would like to thank the FCDO of supporting this and the CEPR of supporting this. And today's lecture will be given by Michele and me. We have about an hour to go, and we decided to split the presentation into two parts. Michele will take it off with a presentation on his recent work, and then I will continue. In interest of organizing this interaction, we would like to ask you to ask urgent clarifying questions as we go along, but there will be room for a brief discussion after each of our two talks. So in the middle, after Michele has spoken, and at the end, after my presentation. And we would like to ask you to keep larger questions, more conceptual questions for these overall discussions. And with this, I hand over to Michele, and you take it away.
Thank you, Uwe. So just to begin our lecture of today, so our topic, the one that we are covering in our talk today and in general in our role in the recipe program is related to the relationship between conflict and investment. And in particular, we look at very different elements which are connected to the idea of this mutual relationship between conflict and investment in health, fertility, education, economic activity. So essentially, our part of research is summarized somehow in this review article that has been published in the Economic Policy, and this is just to give you the reference for this. Also because part of what we are going to say today, me and also Uwe, is already in this chapter, and so those that may be interested in expanding a bit more what we are saying today can have a look at this chapter and find more pieces of literature that need to be explored more in the future for research and policy impact. So to give you a very brief overview of what we're gonna do today, I'm starting with this presentation about, in particular, the relationship between conflict and economic activity, and I'm gonna present the paper that you see here, while Uwe is later on talking about medication against conflict, question mark, and he's gonna present three different papers on this topic. So to be very quick and not to waste more time, I'm gonna, sorry, okay, I did it wrong, okay. Okay, do you see this? No? No? What is happening? Okay, now, Uwe, do you see this?
Now
okay,
you should do full screen, and then yes.
Okay, okay. So as I was saying, I'm going to present you in these 25 minutes this paper, this recent paper that I wrote together with Emanuele Brancati from Sapienza University of Rome and Roberta Gatti and Asif Islam from the World Bank. The title is Under Pressure, Global Evidence on Conflict and Firms. This is a paper which starts from the observation that nowadays, unfortunately, conflict events are spreading around, and this is becoming something that every type of economy is experiencing in different forms. So recent data indicates that more than 167 countries have recorded at least one incident of political violence in 2024. And more than 20 countries are categorized as being with extreme high or turbulent levels of conflict. This ends up in having like 1.7 billion people around the world living in fragile or conflict-affected countries. Now, what is interesting from the perspective of an economist is that despite the dramatic suffering and challenges caused by conflicts, economic activities continues in these countries. We have example of this every day in the context of Ukraine, but also nowadays in other parts of the world where we have a conflict and still economic activity continues. So what is interesting for understanding this situation, understanding how this is possible and why, what do firms do to survive in these situations. Now, obviously, this is not a new question. There is a literature already looking at the effect of conflict and political violence on firm outcomes. But this literature is not so large. Essentially, it is summarized in this slide. So these are all the papers, or let's say, to the best of my knowledge, all the papers that have looked at the effect of conflict on firm activity in different countries. As you see, these in red are the names of the country, and we have example of studies conducted in Angola, in West Bank, a few in Colombia and Ukraine, and so on. All these are very, very nice papers that I suggest you, if you're interested, to read carefully because they are very inspiring. But they all share one element, the fact that they are conducted in one specific country, considering one specific type of conflict. So all the results are very interesting, but also somehow confined to the fact that they are looking at one specific situation. So what we try to do in this project instead is try to look at having a global perspective on the effect of political violence and conflict on firms. So considering these impacts across different countries. So our attempt is first of all to document the effect of conflict on firms, but also especially to identify the mechanisms that explain this negative impact, as you can imagine. And the last part of the story will be to try to identify some characteristics at the country level which mediate the effect of conflict on firms' outcomes. So to give you the results of the paper in one slide, so if I run short of time, you still have the take-home message. Essentially, this is a paper in which we try to do this analysis using the largest possible sample of countries. In particular, we use longitudinal geolocalized firm-level data for 89 countries for the period 2006 and 2019. As you will see, this is not, we don't have data for all the years, but these are the final and the first year for which we have data. And we use data to construct firm-specific measures of conflict exposure. So essentially, we use a methodology that allow us to link geographically the number of events that occur close to the firm to the performance of the firm during the same period of analysis. What we find, the first set of results is not very surprising. In fact, we find that higher conflict exposure reduces sales, and this is quite expected somehow, but we also find that higher conflict exposure reduces total cost, essentially the expenditure of firms in acquiring inputs for production. And this is interesting because it was not really what we were thinking was the first effect of what we would find, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about the possibility that there are obstacles to acquiring these inputs, and so the firm can't buy everything it needs to produce. And third results, the combination of these two effects, so the reduction in sales, but also the reduction in cost and expenditure, give us a zero effect on profits. This effect is on average null, which implies that there are cases in which the effect on profits is negative, but on average we don't find a negative statistical significant effect. So somehow suggesting that there is an adaptation of the firm to the condition of conflict, which implies that facing a reduction in sales, the firm somehow reduces the expenditure to mitigate the negative effects on profits. The second part of the analysis is probably the most interesting one because it looks at the mechanism through which these main effects take place. The first one looks at sales. What we find is that sales decrease because conflict has two main effects. On one hand, as we said, firms' access to production input is restricted, so there is less availability of production input, which obviously mechanically lowers output. And at the same time, we are somehow able to show that conflict also increases informal competition faced by our firms, which are operating in the formal sector, suggesting that this can be an explanation for the reduction in sales, because we know that competition from informal firms is very difficult to face by formal ones. So these two mechanisms contribute to explain the reduction in sales. At the same time, we also find evidence that indicates that total costs decrease because of conflict. On one hand, because, as we say, the inputs are less available, and so there is a mechanical reduction in intermediate in the inputs and raw material acquisition, which obviously leads to a reduction in total cost. But we also find that conflict induces firm to substitute skilled with unskilled workers. So there is a substitution towards workers which are cheaper, with implying that there is a reduction in labor cost, which is an important component of total cost. So these two mechanisms indicates a reduction in total cost, as we said at the beginning. And this combined with the reduction in sales explain why there is no significant effect on profits. In the last part of the paper, we look at the heterogeneity in this mechanism. In particular, we look at the country level characteristics, and we document that there are several country characteristics which somehow mitigates or exacerbates these effects on both sales and profit. And in particular, we find that an increase in conflict exposures reduces both sales and profits, meaning that the effect is stronger when the country is characterized by low level of economic complexity and it's very open to trade, or when there is high corruption and the quality of bureaucracy is very low, or finally when the country is also a country in which there is production of illegal drugs and the country is initially at peace. This last result is something that was very interesting for us to discover somehow, because it's telling us that there is a very strong marginal negative effect of conflict exposure when the country starts from a situation in which there is no conflict. So like saying that the effect of conflict is stronger where firms somehow are not used to have a situation of conflict. On the other hand, the effect is still negative, but relatively smaller in contexts in which somehow firms have already learned how to adapt to a situation of instability and violence. So if you, so this is the summary of the paper, as I said in one slide. If you have any question, or maybe I can just go and move on the data and the analysis. I go then.
I think you can go.
Okay, perfect. So very quickly, given the little time that I have, the data, which are a very important part of our story. So we start from the World Bank Enterprise Survey, which is the survey conducted by the World Bank in several countries, actually more than 89 countries in the world, in which it collects information on different aspects. The important part of the story is that the questionnaire that is distributed to the firm is standardized across time and across country, which gives us a very large set of information that can are comparable across countries and time. An important special feature of the dataset that we use is that we also have information on geolocalization of the firm. This is a confidential information which allow us to obviously locate the firm and then link that to the amount of conflict events that are occurring in the neighborhood of the firm. I will tell you more about that in a second. So our sample, importantly, is comprised only formal firms, which are the firm interviewed in this survey, and they are non-agricultural firms. So we have service and manufacturing. There are several issues potential issues related to selection, missing value, and attrition that unfortunately I cannot discuss now, but there is a long discussion in the paper about how we check that these are not serious concern for the representativeness of our analysis. And I have to, skip this part for the time being. We combine this data on firms on data on conflict events. In particular, what we use in our analysis is information from the Integrated Crisis Early Warning System datasets. This is a dataset which provides information on location, date, and actors of all social political interaction events which have occurred between 2016 and 2019. Importantly, this dataset covers all the countries that we have in our WBS dataset. And this is very important because this is a feature that is only available for this dataset. In fact, the most commonly used dataset, namely ACRE dataset, has not the same coverage in terms of countries and time. So essentially in our main analysis, we are going to use ICEPs for the main results, and we are going to use ACRE as a robustness dataset. As you will see, results are very, very similar. In any case, in our main analysis, we're going to use ICEPs, and we are going to consider conflict events all events which are defined to be hostile and are violent, according to a definition that we discuss in detail in another paper, as you see, this one, Amodi et al., published in the Journal of European Economic Association 2021. So just a way to select among all these type of events, those that are relevant in our situation. Then we have another set of data that I don't have time to discuss now, but we will see at the end how we use information on the country level as we report here. Okay, so the empirical strategy actually is super simple. So in our analysis, we essentially regress different outcomes at the firm level, which are sales, total cost, profits, but also number of workers and number of competitors, so on our measure of conflict exposure, as you see, where our measure of conflict exposure is the log 1 plus number of conflict events that have occurred in the 20 kilometers radius of the firm during the 12 months before the end of the fiscal year. So essentially, we are counting for each firm the number of events that have occurred close to the firm, where by close we mean exactly this 20 kilometers radius during the fiscal year. As I said, we select these conflict events using the ICEDEP dataset, but we have robustness for the source of the data using also ACLED, and we also use different radius for the conflict measure. We will see that when we discuss the robustness. We have obviously in our regression some control for the firm characteristics, and then we use firm and year fixed effect. So this is a very basic kind of regression, which gives us our baseline results, which are shown in this table, in which you can see there are three different outcomes, so sales, total cost, and profits. For each, we have just two columns. The first one is only a regression which we use fixed effects with no controls, and while in the second one we have controls. The reason is that these controls are potentially bad controls, so we want to show you that things do not change whether or not we control for these characteristics at the firm level. So as you can see, the higher conflict exposure, meaning the number of events that occur close to the firm, the lower are sales, the effect is very strong and significant, the lower are total cost, and while negative, we don't find a negative effect, a significant effect on profits. So in terms of magnitude, the magnitude is not small. So we find that the one standard deviation increase in the number of conflict events occurring close to the firm, in our case, these events are 8 events for 1 year, imply a reduction of median sales by 2.8%, which are more or less $10,000 for a year, which is not small given the size of our the firm in our sample, which are not very large firms. Now, obviously, I'm running a bit, but I anticipate that most of you may have some concern about how to interpret this in a causal way. And the only thing I can tell you now in this short presentation is that we have done our homework very carefully. And so we did a lot of analysis trying to convince the reader that we can discard most of the trace to identification. And this is the list of the exercise that we perform to convince that what we are documenting is a causal relationship running from conflict to firm performance. Unfortunately, I don't have to not even name them, but these are discussed in detail in the paper. Now, obviously, we did also a lot of robustness checks. The things that I just want to point your attention to is that the fact that results do not change if we change the measure of conflict exposure, whether we use 5 kilometers around the firm or 10 or 40, the results are qualitatively exactly the same. And also if we select differently the type of conflict events, or as I already told you several times, if we use ACLED, even though obviously we are forced to do the analysis on a smaller sample. The other thing that is important to mention is that also with the sample that we use, so the WBS is the best sample that we can use in terms of firms, because the other alternative, which would be, for instance, Orbis, do not give us enough observation for most of the countries. So WBS is exactly the best data set that you can use to do this type of analysis. I go now telling you about the mechanism, because I still have like 10 minutes. And this is the list of all the mechanisms that we discuss in the paper. So essentially, we try to explore 5 different mechanisms, starting from intermediate labor, inputs and raw materials, and then labor market competition, demand, and other obstacles. So this slide essentially will summarize for you the results of this analysis. What we do is to run the same regression that we run in the baseline, in which we change the dependent variable considering different possible mechanisms. I will show you one table and then I will only report you the results. So essentially what we do is looking at the effect of conflict exposure, the same variable that we used before to look at the effect on sales, total cost, and profits. But now our dependent variable will be one of these other potential mechanisms, namely the expenditure in raw material intermediate cost, or the expenditure in electricity, the number of power outages, the percentage of imported inputs, and so on. So the basic structure of the regression is always the same. We're going to change the dependent variable. So I'm going to just summarize what we find in this analysis. And as for the first mechanism, what we find is that conflict exposure, so an increase in the number of conflict events that occur around the firm, reduces the expenditure in domestic inputs and imported inputs. So essentially we can show that the value of the expenditure in domestic and imported inputs goes down. Now, the data do not provide us the split between quantity and prices, but as it's very unlikely that during a conflict the prices of inputs go down, we can read this as a result of a reduction in quantities. So essentially we are reading our reduction in the value as a reduction in quantities of inputs, domestically and imported ones. We also find the same result for electricity, which is also combined with the finding that the higher conflict exposure, the more are power outages. And this obviously is a clear indication that production goes down, because the electricity is a key input in production. If you have more power outages, obviously production will be interrupted and reduced. The second mechanism that we explore is related to labor. Again, here we find a reduction in total labor cost. Interestingly, this effect do not go through employment, but instead goes through the substitution between skilled and unskilled workers. So the lower average wage, which explains the lower total cost in labor, is the results of a reduction in the high-skilled workers employed by the firm and an increase in unskilled ones. The third mechanism that we explore probably is the most interesting one, because it's newer to the literature. In particular, we are able to document that the increase in conflict increases the competition from the informal sector to the formal firm, which are those in our sample. So we find that firms which are more exposed to conflict events also report higher in terms of intensity and in terms of seriousness of the threat, competition from the informal sector. This is an interesting result because it tells us that the conflict not only changes the behavior of the firms, but also changes the behavior of the markets around the firms. And so this is an interesting channel through which conflict may affect the behavior of formal firms in developing countries. The other two mechanisms that we explore are the demand and another set of obstacles related to finance, corruption, etc. These are less important in our case. In fact, we can show that we have some evidence that conflict reduces sales in all final markets, including the market for those that full exporters. Now, what does this mean? It means that demand is not the main driver of our results, because if also full exporters, so firms that export all their production, have a reduction in sales, this obviously means that the reduction in local demand, so in domestic demand due to conflict, cannot explain the reduction in sales. So this is, we obviously don't have information on consumer preferences or choices. We just have information on the firm side. So we infer essentially that demand is not the main driver, but we interpret this effect on exporters as suggesting that this is not so important in our analysis. And we also do not find effects going through changes in the finance or corruption mechanism as obstacle, and not even an increase in crime or security costs. So essentially, these are not important driver of our main results. Conflict has no effect on the difficulty for the firm to access finance, nor on the fact that they report more crime or security costs. So these are all effects which are second order with respect to the effect that we document in the first three mechanisms related to the difficulty to access inputs or the effect on the labor market and on market competition. So to conclude the analysis of mechanisms, just to summarize in one slide what we are just described in detail, what we find is that sales decrease because conflict restricts firm access to production inputs. So this is indicated in the fact that, for instance, electricity goes down and so output decreases, but also sales go down because there is more competition from informal firms. At the same time, total costs go down because there is less expenditure in intermediate inputs and raw materials because mechanically firms cannot buy what they need, essentially. But at the same time, firms also change the composition of their labor force, increasing the share of unskilled workers. As a result, sales declines and profit do not change because firms can somehow adapt to the new condition by reducing also production cost and labor cost. So the last step of our analysis looks at heterogeneity, both at the firm level and the country level. Actually, we find very little difference at the firm level. So this doesn't seem to be the dimension that we should discuss now. So there are very little firm characteristics which matter, but instead there are several country characteristics which may mediate the effect of conflict on firm performance. Starting from differences which you may expect to have a role, but they don't, we find that there is no difference in the effect of conflict exposure on firm behavior between firms located in countries which are characterized by high or low per capita income. So essentially, the effect of conflict is not different depending on the country economic development level on average, or the general one. And also there is no difference depending on the country being highly specialized in natural resources or on the fragility level of the country. Instead, there are other characteristics which matter a lot, and in particular we find that the effect of conflict is negative on sales, but also on profit in firms located in countries which have low level of economic complexity or which are very highly exposed to trade, which essentially means in our context, which are very dependent on the trade. And this is reasonable for what we have said, because if the firms are very much dependent on imports, when conflict makes more difficult to import inputs, obviously firms are more impacted. At the same time, we find that countries characterized by high corruption or low quality bureaucracy make the adaptation of the firm more difficult. So firms are more negatively impacted by the same type of conflict events if they are located in countries which are less able to cope with these shocks. And also the same happens in countries which are producing also illegal drugs, which means that they're also characterized by high level of criminality, and also those that are initially at peace. So essentially, the marginal effect of conflict events is stronger, is more negative in countries which have not experienced already conflict. The last slide I'm gonna show you is a slide in which we look at this difference between countries which are initially in conflict or initially at peace. And as you can see, here we are looking at the mechanism now. And the reason I want to show you is because this difference between countries in terms of the initial situation matters a lot in terms of the mechanism which are operating. So this is the full set of results, and this is the set of results which are significant. As you can see, these are very different between the two types of countries. This is important for two reasons. The first one is that thinking about which are the policies that one may want to implement, this depends very much on this initial condition of the country. Depending on this, one may want to operate on the access, for instance, on the number of available workers or on the availability of skilled workers and so on, but also the fact that most of the mechanisms that we have discussed in our presentation are operating only for countries which are initially at peace, suggesting somehow that the difference is exactly what we were thinking of before. So countries which are already in conflict are characterized by firms which have already somehow experienced conflict and so have already adapted this situation, while those that are located in countries which are not already in conflict may need time to adapt, and so there are more mechanisms operating in terms of them to react to conflict exposure. So this is the end of my presentation. This is the last slide, which is again my paper in one slide. So I hope that even though I was running, I gave you the basic idea of our analysis, and in any case, you have the paper available online if you may want to go deeper into the details. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Michele. You already have a few requests for the paper, and I asked people to send an email directly to you. There are several questions in the Q&A. Two are relating to substitution between skilled and unskilled workers.
Yes.
Do you want to say something on that?
Okay. So as I said, all the analysis, including those on the mechanism, obviously are somehow constrained by the data availability. Now, one data availability limitation is exactly on the side of labor. So these are the only information that we have on the labor, because we only observe labor from the firm side. So we don't have information from the worker side. And so what we see is that there is this increase in the percentage of unskilled workers, and let's say, paired with a reduction in the unit wage cost. Unfortunately, we can't say much more than this. The only thing I can add now is this additional table that I didn't show you, in which we can exclude that this mechanism is related to a shortage of supply of skilled workers. As you see, this last column here says that conflict exposure do not impact firms saying that they cannot find enough skilled workers, because this is a variable of measuring firms saying that an obstacle that they have is the supply of skilled workers. As you can see, this is not significant. So essentially, we can exclude that the problem is on the supply side of skilled workers, and so that the reduction in the demand is driven in the number of skilled is driven by the demand of the firm. And at the same time, we can exclude that there is a change in terms of temporary workers versus full-time workers, again, for the same reason. So essentially, we are arguing that is a demand story rather than a supply one, even though there are specific
Michele,
contexts in which obviously it's a supply one. Yes.
you also have additional questions, so let me push you on those. So there's one question or several questions on data. One
Yes.
related to why you use firms with 22 employees or more, one about the differences in findings between IQs and ACLED, and one about the differences across industries related to more conflict affected sectors, so war economies, where particular businesses or particular sectors might be more affected than others. Could you say something on that?
Okay, super interesting question on all the three. Thank you. So very quickly, so essentially the 22 employees is just the median. So we have firms from 5 to more than 200 employees. So the 5 limit below limit is given by the survey itself. So the formal lower bound is 5. So this is just the average. The other question was about the difference between ACLED and ICEPs. Very interesting questions. In general, the results are very similar. The only difference is that when we use ACLED, we also find some evidence of a negative effect. This is the table. Sorry. Some effects also on the profit. So there is a negative effect on profit. This is ACLED, this column here, sales, total cost, and profit. As you can see, there is a negative effect here, which is easily explainable by explained by the fact that ACLED events are much more violent on average than those collected by ICEPs. So somehow this is telling us that when you consider more violent events, there is also a negative effect on profits. So again, there is a long discussion on this in the paper about what ACLED is capturing differently from ICEPs in our analysis. But as you can see, the other results are pretty consistent with our main results. And the last question, very interesting again, about the difference across sectors. In fact, we didn't find much difference in terms of sector. Here we have the only difference is that we find no effect for sectors defined as other services and non-metallic. While I can't tell you more than this because there's no other possibility to differentiate even more. And we also find that on average, we find the profit in negative for furniture and transportation sectors. These are the only heterogeneity that we find at the sectoral level. Again, on profits, this makes a lot of sense because furniture, we expect that sales and profits go down, but also transportation because it's obviously one of the sectors is more impacted directly by the conflict.
Then
I
there
think
is
I
a
have to.
sorry, there is a question on profitability and or in contrast to returns to capital. So do you have anything about returns on capital invested?
No. This is a very nice question, important one, but we don't have information on capital per se. No,
Then
there
we
is
have
no.
one question about buffers, so effects fading out in terms of spatial distance. And we have a question about policy. So what can be done about policy?
Okay, I think we have to stop.
Okay.
Because otherwise we run out of time. Okay, I thank you for the people who asked this question. There is a very detailed discussion about the issue about buffer, which is super important for us. I really, if someone want to write me this question personally, I will write them back. It's very interesting because it tells you a story about how important is the overall effect of conflict above and beyond the position of the firm. This is the only question, the answer that I can give you now. And on policy, so we read all our results about mechanism as a policy implication. So the idea is that if you identify which is the main mechanism that brings you reduction in sales, this is where you have to intervene, either on improving the access to imported inputs, either on the labor market, either on controlling the informality in the market competition. Thank you, everybody. I have to now switch to be the presenter of Uwe.
Yes.
Otherwise, we run out of time. So please,
I hope you
the
can
floor
see
is
the
yours.
slides. Thanks a lot, Michele, for sticking to the time. I hope I will
Thank
do
you.
that too. So my presentation relates to a question that is literally a question, medication against conflict. And it's based on the usual observation that, of course, there is a relation between conflict and health. And that is the one that conflict without questions leads to impediments in public health, leads to human suffering through casualties, through breakdown of health infrastructure, through refugee movements, through the outbreak of epidemics, and so on. Which, of course, raises the question then, okay, what drives violence? Because then health outcomes are just a subsidiary consequence. And the usual answers that you get if you look at the literature are related to, say, deep factors. It could be weak institutions, institutional failure, grievances that are related to natural resources, the exploitation of particular natural resources, ethnicity, and many others. Yeah, and if you then think about, okay, when does conflict break out? And here I'm mostly concerned, of course, about internal conflicts, not about international wars. And I'm also looking at social violence. So the things that go on within countries. Triggers are often mentioned as income shocks, commodity price shocks, things that just make grievances unbearable, and that leads to outbreaks of protests, riots, and so on. Which then, of course, raises the question, what can we do in terms of policy? And the answer to that would be, well, if institutional failure is at the heart of conflict outbreaks, we should improve institutions. If it is income, low development, grievances, then we should improve the economic conditions under which people live in order to ameliorate their living conditions, in order to increase the opportunity costs of violence, and potentially also to help development in a broader sense. Now, in this paper or in this lecture, I want to flip the direction of causality and the argumentation. And the question here would be, can we also think about health or bad health as a driver of violence, not only as a consequence, without questioning that there is, of course, a causal link between violence, going from violence to health. Is there also a potential for the reverse direction of causality? And that's important because if you think about policy, then it would mean, well, in case there is a causal link from health to violence, well, maybe there is something that we can do about it by improving health conditions and by making public health interventions. And this is, of course, going through different channels that I already alluded to. So why would that improve the situation, not only in health, but also in terms of conflict outcomes? Well, because it would increase productivity and it would make living conditions better on the people that are benefiting from better health conditions. It would reduce their expenditures that they have on health, on medication. It would potentially also raise their future orientation and make them more long-lived if they have the belief that there is not an imminent risk of dying from epidemics and so on. So this is essentially the background that motivates what I want to talk about. And what I want to talk about is 3 recent papers that I was able to write with co-authors of mine. And these 3 are literally linked through the questions and the logic of the argument that I want to unfold here. So the first paper will ask the question, do health shocks cause violence? So is there a causal link from health or health shocks to violence? The second paper will then move up one level and ask, can we then, by implementing better health conditions through policy, prevent violence actively? And lastly, we're asking an important caveat question, which is, well, if we improve health, if we reduce mortality from bad health, that leads to an increase in population, and wouldn't that run the risk of triggering a Malthusian type of conflict channel, something that has been mentioned again and again in the past and has had a recent research in the literature. And I want to go quickly on each of these papers just to provide you with the insights that we found. So the first paper is on the question, do health shocks cause violence? And here we jump into a very specific context. And the specific context is one that allows us to isolate causal effects in a hopefully credible way. And this context is malaria outbreaks, malaria epidemics in Africa. What we're going to do is we're going to see a reduced form effect of health shocks on civil violence that will be a positive one. And how do we isolate the causal effect? We're going to combine 2 elements for this identification approach. One is heterogeneity in the long-term exposure to malaria, which itself affects the susceptibility of the population or the immunity of the population, if you will. And the second element will be a trigger, a short-term trigger, which is suitable conditions for the outbreak of a malaria epidemic that is related to weather conditions that are plausibly exogenous to any sort of violent activities, conflicts, or the underlying causes in a country or in a region. So just to give you a very quick background, malaria is useful in this particular context for its pathology, if you want. Malaria is caused by the Plasmodium parasite, and it cannot be transmitted from human to human. So that means that even in the context of conflict, unlike intestinal diseases and so on, this is not something that can be easily transmitted from human to human. What it needs, in fact, is a vector, and the vector is the Anopheles mosquito. This mosquito, in turn, needs a particular bioclimatological environment, and that means it needs suitable weather conditions, and that's usually sufficiently warm, but not too hot, and sufficiently humid, but not too wet conditions. We build on a literature that has actually isolated the particular conditions that need to be satisfied. This is an index of malaria force and transmission by Kijewski, that is frequently used. I don't want to go into details here. I just want to show you that if you look at Africa, at the level of grid cells that we are using, there is a lot of heterogeneity in this exogenous latent pressure of malaria. Yeah, so here you see the grid cells, one by one latitude, longitude, degree. The blue grid cells are not at all affected. They have no endemic risk of malaria in the Sahara or in South Africa. But in the sub-Saharan region, you see quite a lot of heterogeneity in this endemicity, in this force of malaria stability and transmission. Now, what happens in these areas? What happens is that in the areas where there's a lot of permanent pressure of malaria, these are the red cells, people are very often year by year, exposed to these suitable conditions of malaria and therefore with malaria infections. And that has very bad consequences in the sense of there is very high child mortality. Children suffer the most from these malaria outbreaks. But if children survive and they are sort of prepared for additional infections, they develop what we would call an acquired immunity. And this acquired immunity leads to infections becoming less and less symptomatic as people age in these areas. This is a graph that we've taken from another publication in the literature, but it nicely illustrates that the severe malaria in these areas mostly affects people at young ages, but the severity goes down as people develop these acquired immunities. And this is the logic of our identification strategy, that in regions where you have a lot of risk, there is also a lot of acquired immunity. In regions where there is no risk, there is no risk. But in regions where there's intermediate endemic pressure, that's where a malaria outbreak, a latent malaria outbreak, meets a population that is less prepared in terms of acquired immunities for the malaria. And that is where adults are particularly susceptible of developing severe symptoms. There is also a genetic immunity component here, which is related to evolutionary pressure. This is a second dimension of immunity that we're going to use, which has to do with particular traits. And one of them is the sickle cell trait that, without going into the detail, impedes the possibility of the plasmodium to multiply in the human metabolism. So these genetic immunities, we're going to use it for the identification strategy. And finally, the suitable weather conditions, they are what, once they arrive in this area, they are what lead to a multiplication of these Anopheles mosquitoes that, if they carry the Plasmodium parasite, they lead to this outbreak of an epidemic. Yeah, they are very sensitive. And what we compute then, again, based on literature before, is month by month for each of these cells, we compute, are there suitable conditions for malaria outbreaks? So these are the malaria suitable months, MSM, that we compute, and here you see the conditions for that. The empirical strategy then is very simple. So we use these grid cells, we compute for each grid cell at the month level, are there suitable conditions for an outbreak, yes or no? It's an intention to treat. And then we compare the effects of these conditions in high-risk areas, which are the areas that have some endemicity, but not the high stability index, but the low stability index values. These are the areas that we call the epidemic areas, in contrast to the endemic areas. And then we exploit within cell variation at yearly and monthly frequencies to isolate the effect in a regression where we regress violence on malaria suitable months, but we're mostly interested in the effect of a malaria suitable month happening in an epidemic area, EA. Conditional on all sorts of controls, including cell fixed effects, month fixed effects, country by year fixed effects, and so on. What are the results? These are the main results for this paper. So what we see here is, you see, it holds for different specifications that in a month that has suitable conditions for Anopheles flies to multiply particularly well, we see not an increase in violent events in areas that have high endemicity or zero risk of malaria. But in epidemic areas where the malaria outbreak hits a population of adults that is low in terms of acquired immunities, that is where we see a significant increase in violence month by month. This is the main finding, and this is what we interpret as the plausible causal effect of malaria outbreaks on violent events. What about the mechanisms? So we looked at several things. One is weather conditions have been used in the literature a lot to isolate conflict outbreaks as a proxy or an instrument for income shocks. But the literature is mostly focused on these weather conditions affecting the growing season of the crops in these cells. Now, what we want to isolate is something that works through humans. So it would be logically, logical to expect that if it affects labor productivity, it would not be the growing season in which the malaria outbreak is particularly detrimental for conflict or leading to a larger effect in conflict, but it would be the harvesting seasons, the seasons in which labor is particularly needed for agricultural production. And this is exactly what we find. So when we do some heterogeneity here, we focus only on the epidemic areas in order to avoid triple diff and diffs, or triple interaction effects. But when we look at the heterogeneity, it is mostly positive during the harvest months. Yeah, it is the malaria suitable months that hit the harvesting season, and here the harvesting seasons are cell-specifically constructed by using at soil suitability indices for particular crops, and then finding in the crop calendars what are the particular months in which these crops need to be harvested in that cell. And we see the particularly strong effect for the harvest seasons. On the side, you also see a negative effect on conflict when there is harvest season. So this would speak for the opportunity cost channel. What about immunities? I talked before about genetic immunities. You see that when you look at the sickle cell trait prevalence in the population as a proxy for genetic immunity, you see that the effect is moderated. And the same you find for a greater prevalence of anti-malaria policies like bed nets, like spraying campaigns, and so on. So this is the first paper. It finds some evidence for causal effect on health, and it actually gave us an idea for the next paper, which is, if there is a prevalence of policies that is able to moderate the effect, can that be used for another causal identification? Here I should say the prevalence of anti-malaria policies might be something that is actually related to conflict, because in conflict or after conflict, there is greater attention. There is international health aid going into particularly vulnerable or affected zones. So these effects are literally heterogeneity effects. They can't be taken as causal evidence. Which brought us to this next paper, Medication Against Conflict, that we wrote with the same set of co-authors and additional co-authors, and in which we want to look at the causal effect of health campaigns on violence and the question, do they help to prevent violence? And here what we do is we exploit the HIV AIDS epidemic in Africa. What is the background? Well, in the 90s and in the 80s and 90s, HIV spread across the world, but it spread particularly in Africa. And the consequences of that HIV epidemic were really horrendous. And there's a lot of literature about the negative effects on labor productivity, on resources. I mean, it caused a huge one, maybe the biggest health problem in the last century. And there were increased worries that it might also lead to greater violence because of all the human suffering that it brought. During the 1980s and 90s, though, there was a lot of medical research, and it was extremely successful in quickly isolating the virus that is responsible for HIV, and also to then develop treatments. And these treatments are the so-called antiretroviral treatments, ART. At the beginning, they were very successful, but they were very expensive. And then there were global health campaigns and an attempt to actually spread the ART coverage worldwide, make these ART drugs affordable. And then since 2002, ART prices dropped dramatically. And by 2005, there was a massive rollout worldwide in terms of provision of countries and regions with the ART drugs. And that led to a dramatic decline in the negative consequences and a dramatic increase in life expectancy of HIV positive individuals and also their productivity. And of course, it reduced the costs from HIV. So what we then did was basically developing an identification strategy that could use this as a causal driver of a reduction in health provision. I have to be a bit running in order to keep time, but this is essentially the paper in one figure. Here you have a timeline. In the upper panel of the figure, you have a timeline of the ART coverage as a percentage of people infected. And at the same time, the solid line is the HIV prevalence in the population. And you see as the coverage with ART went up, we see a trend reversal in HIV prevalence. And when we look at the differential conflict activity in areas with high and low HIV prevalence, we see that also there's a reversal that is related to the emergence of ART coverage worldwide, which is the green area. Yeah? And the whole paper is essentially about showing that this is robust to all sorts of potential confounds in an identification strategy. The identification strategy is a two-stage least squares IV type of strategy. On the outcome side, we regress conflict on ART coverage and controls. In the first stage, we instrument ART coverage by the country-specific prevalence of HIV before the ART rollout. So this is what we would call the scope for ART in terms of reducing HIV infection rates or the negative consequences of that. That is a cross-sectional variation. And then over time, we have variation in ART, either in the global variation of access to ART or in the prices for ART or even in the costs of producing ART drugs. So here is the results. We have an OLS that I wouldn't spend time on, but the two-stage least squares outcome equation says there is a negative effect of ART instrumented the way I described on social violence as measured in the ACLED data. There's a significant negative effect, and here you see the intention to treat. When you just run conflict on the instrument, you also see a significant and negative effect. With alternative instruments, the prices, the costs, and a synthetic price index, you see literally very similar results. So that seems to be robust. What are the channels? Here we look at different types of violence. So SCAT data mostly refer to low-level violent events, conflict events like protests, ACLED, the same, GDELT, the same. But for UCDP data, which is big armed conflict, we don't find anything. So it seems to be that what this health intervention really did is it reduced low-level violence that potentially might be related to grievances. What are the motives? So here we see a reduction in organized violence that is related to economic grievances. We even see some evidence for reduction in household violence. We don't see too much for election violence. And when we go for the channels, we see, so this is based on survey data, I should say. And these survey data allow us to dig a bit deeper into what's going on the ground. And what we see here is that the same identification approach would lead in the same cells to greater approval of government policies with respect to HIV, which is something that one would expect. And as a placebo, we also did it for education management, and we see nothing as expected. But we also see a bit more in terms of trust in institutions and approval of the government. We also see that for trust questions. So the final thing that I wanted to present today then is the natural follow-up question. So if you can really have a successful health intervention campaign, and if that health intervention campaign successfully saves people from dying, it will lead to an increase in the population relative to other areas where these campaigns are absent. This increase in population might actually increase the resource pressure, population density. And this is what people have called a Malthusian channel for conflict. And here what we do is just as a follow-up, try to see if we can see that. What is the background of this Malthusian channel? Well, it's contradictory evidence. You see papers by Brückner or by Acemoglu, Ferguson, Johnson that find evidence for a greater population due to positive effects that have to do with economic shocks or with health campaigns. They find that leads to more conflict. Our evidence that I just presented would suggest the opposite. So the question then is, well, is that true, or what is going on in our particular context? So do health interventions lead to more population growth and therefore more conflict? So the conceptual background is this one. We are interested in social conflict. I just showed you reduced form evidence for health interventions having a negative effect on conflicts. But what about the population growth effect? Is that something that could moderate, ameliorate, or potentially even counteract the positive effects in sense of a negative coefficient on social conflict? And what we do is we take the same data that I just used for the HIV paper, the medication against conflict paper, and we run this intermediate step where the stage 1 is then the population effect. And we indeed find on the first stage that the ART expansion in the areas in which HIV prevalence was very high led, relatively speaking, to faster population growth, exactly as predicted by the Malthusian argument. But then the question is, what about the second stage when we use these predicted population increases? And here we find surprisingly negative effects. So we find a reduction, a significant reduction in violence as the result of a population increase. And we find a reduction which is not significant for armed conflict, for larger scale conflicts. So this is, in our view, strong evidence against a Malthusian channel that would tone down or even counteract the positive effects in the sense of conflict reduction of health interventions. And we also can control for additional things. So let me conclude by the findings that we have here, which is evidence for causal effect of disease outbreaks on conflict, evidence for moderating effect of health policy on conflict. So medication can work as double dividend, so to speak. So medication, health interventions can have a double dividend. Beyond improving health and labor productivity, they can even lead to a reduction in conflict. And we find no evidence for Malthusian mechanisms. And that's where I leave it for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uwe. You were perfectly on time. So as I see now, there is one question which was raised during your first paper, asking about how these results are affected by considering also climate change, or more in general global warming, let's say, or nutrition deficit. So how these may also take part into the story.
Very good question. So we would argue that climate change would be captured here by a lot of the controls that we have. So what do we have here? We have year fixed effects. So systematic climate change would be captured by a trend in temperature, humidity, and these things. but we would suck it out by year fixed effects, or in particular by country by year fixed effects. So country-specific year fixed or country-specific time trends, if you will. So to the extent that it's captured, global warming or climate change would be not changing these results. But what we have actually done also in this paper was, I didn't show it, but was a question like that, asking, wouldn't climate change increase the scope for malaria outbreaks to areas that before were potentially less affected? And that is a very important point, I think. That would, in fact, lead me to say, yes, climate change could increase the risk of malaria, epidemic malaria conditions in particular, ranging out to areas where it was not a problem before. And then that would also lead to more conflict. And that is something that I would very much underscore.
Thank you. There is another one, which is probably even more complicated. So, would government-controlled areas in conflict areas inherently have better health intervention to government support? So, question about how the presence of different type of, let's say, entities controlling the area would have an impact. So, might the government even bolster health facilities to bolster local population support? So, how much of this provision of health can be somehow endogenous to the conflict itself?
So there's two sides to that question. On the one hand, that was exactly the problem I was talking about related to anti-malaria policies. So since we don't know where these policies were located and why they were in certain cells, it's very hard for us to make a causal statement on this. This is just effect heterogeneity, and it could well be that there are measurement issues, that there is potential endogeneity. That's why we try to write the second paper, where we believe that it can only work through the scope for the policy. So that is what we did. The second thing is, so the whole line of research is somehow done in the hope that this can be used for policy and for policy, not only for health policy, but potentially with this double dividend. That's as much as I can say. I think this is a very underdeveloped area of research, and I would like to see much more research on this. But at the beginning, when we started working on this, people were actually looking at us in a bit of a weird way, saying, well, we know that it's conflict that causes bad health and not the other way around. And it took us a long time to actually convince people that it might be an interesting way of looking at the data.
Okay, so there is another one. Could you say a bit more about the mechanism behind the effect? I assume the question is related to the last one. You mentioned mortality and labor incapacitation, but wouldn't those channels might take time to materialize? Given the timing of these effects, the effect that you estimate, is it possible that faster mechanisms, such, for instance, changes in grievances, trust in government, or expectation, are playing the larger role?
I totally agree. So, but then the question would be, would we estimate a lower bound or an upper bound of the effect? And then my argument would be, if anything, we would estimate a lower bound, because we look at very immediate effects. If they take up more time to build up, maybe the effects would be even stronger. I should say, I mean, you would have to read the paper, but all the results that I showed you based on, not this one, but this one, like on survey data, of course, there are all these problems. Do we have coverage? What is the frequency of the surveys? This is all highly problematic, and this is why I would take this as tentative evidence at best. But again, I think it is suggestive, and it would ask for more research in these details.
Okay, so we are getting question. So regarding the population growth results from our ART rollout, did you consider if internal migration toward these healthier and safer treated areas could eventually lead to new resource extensions that the current model hasn't captured yet?
Very good question. So I wouldn't be able to say it here because this is probably too rough in terms of what we do. Yeah. So here what we do is we do it at the country level. We also did it at the subnational region level, and we find similar results. But the data are very rough. It's not at the cell level that we can do this on population and ART. I know from earlier work that I did in 2019 on, in fact, the effect of global warming on conflict, that there are super big heterogeneities that have to do with, at the cell level, that have to do with migration flows. So this is a paper that I published in World Development in 2019, where we find very heterogeneous effects in cells that lose population and cells that gain population. So that would be internal migration. We didn't do it here for lack of data, but that would be also a very, very interesting way of looking at it. I totally agree. But in the evidence that I showed you, we can't look at that.
Okay, so then there is, I think, a last question. Most of the time in Africa, there is a civil war based on the different ethnicities. Can we say that it is their relation with the Malthusian principle?
Actually, in the identification strategy, we look at a lot of controls. So this is all within country or within subnational region variation. To the extent that the ethnic composition doesn't change, these results will not be affected by ethnicity. Now, if there is heterogeneous population growth across ethnicities, I think that would be an interesting thing to look at. I would have questions whether that would be able to show up at such a short horizon with such high frequency data year by year or such. I don't think it would drive any of our results. I would think that that is also something that one would have to look at, but I have at the top of my mind, I would have question marks whether that can be done with similar empirical strategies as we do here. I think it would all be filtered out.
Okay, I think with this last answer from Uwe, we have to close our class for today. And we thank a lot all those that have taken part to this run very quick presentation of results. And we hope that you will get opportunity to read the chapter, maybe also the papers that we mentioned. I know that everything will be online, so in case you want to see again the presentation or read the papers, you will find the information, and we give you our hello and invite you to attend the next series that will be advertised exactly here. So thank you everybody, and have a good day and afternoon.
Great. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye. Should I close?